The rain fell upon Ashworth Manor in a slow, relentless curtain. As it had fallen for 3 days without ceasing, soaking into the crumbling mortar between ancient stones and dripping through the gap in the library ceiling, where repairs had been promised but never made. Eleanor Ashworth stood at the tall windows of that very library, her slender fingers resting against glass cold enough to make her shiver, watching water pool in the overgrown gardens below, where statues of Greek maidens slowly surrendered to moss and neglect. She was 24, though sometimes she felt centuries older, worn smooth by the quiet erosion of disappointed hopes, the way the rain wore away at the manor's once proud facade. The room around her spoke of faded gentility shelves that had once groaned beneath leather-bound volumes, now showed gaps like missing teeth, the books having been sold one by one to pay her father's debts, though she had managed to secret away her most beloved treasures in a corner he never visited. Asterisk. This is my inheritance. Asterisk, she thought, not without bitterness. Asterisk, a crumbling house and a library of ghosts. Asterisk. Her dove-grey morning dress, carefully mended at the cuffs, whispered against her legs as she turned from the window, and she caught her reflection in a tarnished mirror across the room, pale skin that rarely saw society. Dark hair, simply dressed, eyes that held more resignation than a woman her age should possess. She had made her peace with the future that awaited her, a position as governess in some household where she would be neither family nor servant, forever suspended between worlds, teaching other women's daughters the accomplishments she had learned in happier times. It was an honest fate, at least, more honest than remaining here watching her father drink away what little remained of their dignity. The sound of footsteps in the corridor, uneven and hesitant, pulled her from these melancholy thoughts, and she recognized the peculiar gait of Jenkins, their elderly butler who had stayed on despite months of unpaid wages out of loyalty to her late mother's memory. He appeared in the doorway bearing a silver salver that had somehow escaped the creditors, and upon it lay a letter with a seal she did not recognize, deep crimson wax, stamped with what appeared to be a falcon in flight. "For your father, Miss Eleanor," Jenkins said, his voice carrying a note of something she could not quite identify, hope, perhaps, or apprehension. "From a London solicitor. He is in the study and requests that you attend him after he has read it." Eleanor's heart performed a strange flutter against her ribs. For letters from London, solicitors never bore good news for families such as theirs. They came with demands for payment, notices of foreclosure, lists of assets to be seized. She nodded, smoothing her skirts with hands that had learned not to tremble at every new disaster, and watched Jenkins retreat down the dim corridor before returning her gaze to the rain-soaked grounds, wondering what fresh catastrophe the autumn storm had delivered to their door. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. 20 minutes passed before Jenkins returned to summon her, and Eleanor walked through the familiar corridors with their water-stained wallpaper and threadbare carpets, her mind conjuring 100 variations of ruin, none of which prepared her for what she found in her father's study. Thomas Ashworth sat behind his desk, that massive oak monstrosity that had somehow survived every auction with his head in his hands, and when he looked up at her entrance, she was startled to see tears tracking through the broken veins that branched across his cheeks, those visible markers of his long devotion to brandy and cards. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice broke upon her name like waves against rocks. "My daughter, my dear girl, I have done something unforgivable." She moved closer, her heart hammering now with genuine fear, for she had seen her father drunk, violent, maudlin, and coldly indifferent, but never had she seen him weep with what appeared to be shame. The letter lay open upon the desk, and she could see the elaborate letterhead, the dense legal script, the signature of someone named Blackwood of Blackwood and Associates, solicitors. "What has happened, father?" she asked, and was proud that her voice remained steady. He gestured helplessly at the letter, then poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey from the decanter that was never empty, his hands shaking so badly that amber liquid splashed onto the papers scattered across his desk. "I have sold you," he said flatly, and drank deeply before meeting her eyes. "Not in so many words, not in any way that the law would recognize as such, but that is the truth of it, Eleanor, and I am damned for it." The words made no sense, or rather they made too much sense, and she felt the floor shift beneath her feet as though the manor itself was finally collapsing into the earth. Her father explained haltingly, pausing frequently to drink, that 6 months prior he had found himself at a gaming hell in London, deeper in debt than ever before, when a gentleman had approached him with unusual knowledge of the Ashworth family situation, a gentleman representing Viscount Edmund Hartley of Hartley Hall in Derbyshire. The Viscount, it seemed, had inherited a vast fortune from his late uncle under peculiar terms. He must marry a woman of good family before his 33rd birthday, which was now mere weeks away, or forfeit everything to distant cousins. He needed a wife of gentle birth but modest circumstances, someone whose family would not object to a marriage of pure convenience, someone who would understand that this was a business arrangement and nothing more. In exchange for Eleanor's hand and her cooperation in this matter, all of Thomas Ashworth's debts, and they were substantial, amounting to nearly £10,000, would be discharged, and a sum of £5,000 would be settled upon him annually for the remainder of his life. "I have already signed the preliminary agreements," her father said, not looking at her now, his gaze fixed upon the amber liquid in his glass. "The Viscount's solicitor made clear that time is of the essence. You would need to be married within the month. Eleanor, I know I have no right to ask this of you, no right at all after the ruin I have made of everything your mother left us, but if you refuse, we will lose Ashworth Manor within the fortnight, and I have nowhere else to go." Eleanor stood very still, her hands clasped before her so tightly that her knuckles whitened, and felt something inside her chest that might have been her girlish dreams of love and romance quietly expire, like a candle guttering out in an empty room. She thought of the novels she had read in her deteriorating library, tales of passionate devotion and love conquering all obstacles, and recognized them now for what they had always been, pretty lies, to make bearable the reality that women like her were commodities to be traded for the settlement of debts and the satisfaction of legal requirements. "Does the Viscount wish to meet me first?" she asked, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears, as though it belonged to someone else entirely, someone practical and resigned who had already accepted what Eleanor's heart still struggled against. Her father nodded, relief flooding his features with color that the drink alone had not provided. "His solicitor has arranged for you to travel to Hartley Hall 3 days hence, weather permitting. You will stay as a guest for 2 days, during which the Viscount will determine if you are suitable." The word hung in the air between them, bitter as wormwood, and Eleanor found herself wondering what criteria a man employed when selecting a wife he had no intention of loving, whether he judged by teeth and disposition as one might judge a horse at market. "And if I am found suitable," she said carefully, "and if I agree to this arrangement, what precisely would be expected of me?" Her father pushed the letter across the desk toward her, and she read the terms laid out in merciless legal precision. A marriage would be contracted. She would bear the title of Viscountess. She would have her own household within Hartley Hall, with appropriate staff and a generous quarterly allowance. She would be expected to fulfill certain social obligations as the Viscount's wife. But there would be no expectation of, the letter delicately termed it, marital intimacy beyond that required for public appearance, which Eleanor understood to mean she would share neither his bed nor his heart, merely his name and his house. It was a lonely fate they were offering her, she thought. But was it truly worse than the lonely fate she had already resigned herself to as a governess? At least this way her father would be cared for. The servants who had remained loyal to her mother's memory would receive their back wages, and she would have access to what the letter suggested was an extensive library. Asterisk. What small consolations we clutch at. Asterisk, she thought. Asterisk when drowning. Asterisk. She looked at her father, this weak man who had loved her mother once upon a time before grief and weakness had consumed him, and made her choice. "I will go to Hartley Hall," Eleanor said quietly, sealing her fate with 4 simple words. "I will meet the Viscount, and if he finds me suitable, I will marry him." The carriage her father had hired, and she suspected, given the timing, it had been paid for, by the Viscount's solicitor, departed Ashworth Manor on a morning when the rain had finally ceased, and autumn sunlight broke through clouds in shafts that illuminated the turning leaves with amber and gold, as though nature itself conspired to make the journey toward her uncertain future appear less ominous than it felt. Eleanor sat against worn velvet cushions with her small trunk secured above, containing what few dresses she owned that remained presentable, watching the familiar landscape of her childhood recede through the window with each turn of the wheels, and found herself unable to summon the tears that such a farewell ought to have provoked. Perhaps she had exhausted her capacity for weeping, or perhaps some part of her recognized that she was not truly leaving home, but rather leaving the ruins of what home had been, which was not the same thing at all. The journey northward into Derbyshire took the better part of 2 days, with an overnight stay at a coaching inn where she kept to her room and barely touched the plain supper brought to her, her stomach twisted with an anxiety that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with the meeting that awaited her at journey's end. The countryside grew increasingly beautiful as they travelled, the gently rolling hills giving way to more dramatic terrain, with rocky outcroppings and dense forests that still held their autumn glory, and she pressed her face to the carriage window like a child, drinking in scenery she had only read about in books, thinking that at least if she must be exiled from everything familiar, the location of her exile possessed a wild beauty that spoke to something in her soul. It was late afternoon on the second day when the carriage turned onto a private drive lined with ancient oaks, their branches forming a cathedral arch overhead, and Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as Hartley Hall came into view across a sweep of manicured lawn, not the crumbling gentility of Ashworth Manor, but a true grand estate, all golden stone and tall windows that caught the slanting sunlight, with wings extending on either side of a central structure topped with crenellations that gave it the aspect of something between a palace and a fortress. Asterisk. This is to be my home. Asterisk, she thought, with wonder and terror mingling equally. Asterisk, this place that looks as though it belongs to someone far more significant than I could ever hope to be. Asterisk, the carriage drew to a halt before broad stone steps, where servants had already assembled in neat formation, and as a footman handed her down, Eleanor was acutely aware of her travel-worn dress and simply dressed hair, of how small and insignificant she must appear against the grandeur of her surroundings, and she had to resist the urge to climb directly back into the carriage and beg the driver to return her to her crumbling manor and her familiar poverty. But then the great doors opened, and a man emerged who could only be Viscount Edmund Hartley, and Eleanor found herself unable to look away despite the cold formality of his bearing. He was tall, perhaps a hand's breadth over 6 feet, with dark hair that held hints of auburn in the sunlight, and features that would have been handsome had they not been set in such rigid lines of controlled indifference, a strong jaw, straight nose, and eyes of such pale blue they appeared almost grey in certain lights. Assessing her now, with the detached interest one might show when examining a piece of furniture being considered for purchase, he descended the steps with measured grace, his movements precise and economical, dressed in a coat of dark grey superfine that spoke of London tailoring and considerable expense, and when he reached her, he executed a bow that was correct in every particular and utterly devoid of warmth. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and his voice was a cultured baritone, pleasant in tone but cool as winter frost. "Welcome to Hartley Hall. I trust your journey was not too arduous." Eleanor curtsied, grateful that her governess had drilled proper deportment into her years ago, and met his eyes with what she hoped was appropriate composure. "Lord Hartley, thank you for your hospitality. The journey was quite comfortable. A lie, but a small one, and she suspected he neither believed her nor cared whether the journey had been comfortable or torturous. He offered his arm with the mechanical politeness of someone fulfilling a social obligation, and led her up the steps into an entrance hall so magnificent that she had to consciously prevent her mouth from falling open marble floors in patterns of cream and grey, a double staircase curving upward to a gallery above, oil paintings in gilt frames, depicting what she assumed were Hartley ancestors, and a chandelier of such size and crystal brilliance that it must have cost more than Ashworth Manor's entire worth. "Perhaps you would care to refresh yourself before we speak," Edmund said, already gesturing to a woman who had appeared as silently as a ghost, middle-aged, dressed in black, with keys at her waist that marked her as the housekeeper. "Mrs. Daventry will show you to the blue guest chamber. Shall we say 1 hour, and then meet in my study to discuss the particulars of our arrangement?" Our arrangement, not courtship, not engagement, but arrangement, as though they were negotiating a business contract rather than a marriage, which Eleanor supposed was precisely what this was. She nodded her agreement, and followed the silent Mrs. Deventry up the grand staircase and through corridors hung with more paintings and appointed with more luxury than she had ever imagined, until they reached a chamber decorated in shades of blue and cream that was larger than the entire ground floor of Ashworth Manor's inhabited wing. Exactly 1 hour later, having changed into her best dress, a simple gown of green merino wool that was at least not visibly mended, and having attempted to calm her racing heart through sheer force of will, Eleanor found herself seated across a massive mahogany desk from the man who proposed to make her his wife, without ever pretending to feel anything for her beyond cold expedience. Edmund's study was lined with law books and estate ledgers, masculine and austere, and he sat in his leather chair with perfect posture, his pale blue eyes fixed upon her with that same assessing quality, as though he were still determining whether she would suit his purposes. "I believe in plain speaking, Miss Ashworth," he began without preamble, "so let me be absolutely clear about what I am offering and what I expect in return. My uncle's will stipulates that I must marry before my 33rd birthday, which falls in 3 weeks' time, or forfeit the Hartley fortune and estates to my cousin Theodore, a man whose profligacy and poor judgment would see everything our family has built over generations destroyed within a decade. I have no intention of allowing that to occur. I require a wife of good family to satisfy the terms of the will. In exchange, you will have the title of Viscountess, a generous allowance, your own household within this one, and the freedom to pursue whatever interests you wish within the bounds of propriety. What I do not require, and indeed do not wish, is the sentimental entanglement that so often accompanies marriage. We will maintain separate apartments, separate lives wherever possible, and will come together only when social obligation demands the appearance of a united front. There will be respect between us, certainly, and courtesy, but there will be no pretense of affection where none exists." Eleanor listened to this speech, with her hands folded in her lap to keep them from trembling, and felt that last fragile hope she had not even realized she still harbored, that perhaps this man might come to care for her, that perhaps this arrangement might someday soften into something real, die quietly in her chest. "And children?" she heard herself ask, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. "The will makes no mention of heirs," Edmund replied coolly, "so that matter I leave entirely to your discretion. If you prefer that our marriage remain one of name only, I am content with that arrangement. My cousin Theodore has sons who may inherit after me." He spoke of it so casually, as though he were discussing whether to plant barley or wheat, and Eleanor understood with painful clarity that this man had built walls around his heart so high and thick that no feeling could scale them, and he had no intention of allowing her past those fortifications. "I find your terms acceptable, Lord Hartley," she said quietly, and watched something flicker in those pale eyes, relief perhaps, or was it something darker, something that might have been disappointment quickly suppressed? "Then we are agreed," he said, rising and extending his hand across the desk as one might to seal a business transaction. Eleanor stood and placed her hand in his, and felt the warmth of his palm against hers, the strength in his fingers as they clasped hers briefly before releasing, and thought that this was the most intimate contact they might ever share, this business-like handshake in a study that smelled of leather and beeswax and the faint ghost of tobacco. "I will have the marriage contracts drawn up immediately," Edmund continued, already turning his attention to papers on his desk, dismissing her in all but words. "We will marry in London in a fortnight, quietly, and return here directly after. I believe you will find Hartley Hall comfortable enough, Miss Ashworth, and I assure you I will make no demands upon you beyond the basic courtesy one might show any member of one's household." And with that, Eleanor's fate was sealed as thoroughly as if the contract had already been signed and witnessed, bound to a man who looked at her with eyes like winter sky, and promised her everything except the one thing she had not even known she wanted until it was explicitly denied, the possibility that he might someday love her. The wedding took place on a grey morning in London, when November rain fell against the windows of the small chapel Edmund had selected, precisely because it was unfashionable and unlikely to attract attention, and Eleanor stood beside him in a dress of pale blue silk that his solicitor had arranged to be made for her beautiful and expensive, and chosen by strangers who had measured her like a doll to be costumed, and spoke her vows in a voice that did not waver even as her heart felt like a stone in her chest, cold and heavy, and utterly without hope. Edmund's responses were clear and firm, his pale blue eyes fixed somewhere above the vicar's head rather than on her face, and when the time came for him to place the ring upon her finger, a gold band set with sapphires that had belonged to his grandmother, according to Mrs. Daventry, who had delivered it the night before. His hands were steady, while hers trembled, and she thought wildly that this was all wrong, that weddings should be joyful occasions filled with love and promise, rather than this somber transaction that felt more like a funeral than a celebration. There were no guests beyond the vicar, and 2 witnesses pulled from the street for the purpose. No wedding breakfast, no well-wishers throwing rice and calling blessings. Instead, immediately following the brief ceremony, Edmund handed her into his carriage with the same cool courtesy he might show any lady of his acquaintance, and they departed London for Hartley Hall in a silence, broken only by polite inquiries about her comfort and observations about the weather, as though they had not just bound themselves together for life, as though she had not just become Viscountess Hartley, and he had not just acquired a wife. He had explicitly stated he had no intention of truly making his own. The journey took most of the day, and Eleanor watched the landscape pass outside the window, while acutely aware of Edmund sitting across from her in the carriage, his long legs carefully positioned so as not to accidentally brush against her skirts, his attention focused on papers he had brought with him regarding some matter of estate business, and she understood that this was to be the pattern of their existence: proximity without intimacy, sharing space but not lives, bound by law and circumstance, but separated by walls of his deliberate construction. They arrived at Hartley Hall as twilight was settling over the Derbyshire hills, turning everything to shades of purple and gold, and the servants had assembled to greet their new mistress with considerably more ceremony than had attended the wedding itself, and Eleanor found herself subjected to a bewildering series of introductions to people whose names and positions she could not possibly remember, housemaids and footmen and cook and groundskeeper and butler and more, while Edmund stood beside her with his hand barely touching her elbow, a gesture that appeared solicitous but conveyed no warmth whatsoever. Mrs. Daventry, the stern housekeeper who had shown Eleanor to her room during her first visit, materialized at her elbow once the introductions concluded, and informed her in tones that brooked no disagreement that she would show Lady Hartley to her chambers so that she might refresh herself before dinner. Eleanor followed the woman up the grand staircase and through corridors she half remembered from her previous visit, until they reached a suite of rooms in the east wing that Mrs. Daventry announced would be hers, a bedchamber decorated in cream and gold, with windows overlooking the gardens, a dressing room already supplied with the wardrobe that had been made for her during the weeks before the wedding, and a small sitting room with a writing desk and comfortable chairs arranged before a fireplace, where a cheerful blaze had been lit against the November chill. It was beautiful, all of it, appointed with more luxury than she had ever known, and it was also utterly separate from Edmund's own chambers, which Mrs. Daventry informed her were located in the west wing, quite on the other side of the house, an arrangement that ensured maximum privacy for them both. The housekeeper left her with instructions that dinner would be served at 8 o'clock in the formal dining room, and Eleanor stood alone in the center of her beautiful, lonely chamber and understood with painful clarity that this was her wedding night, that she was a married woman, now a viscountess, mistress of this grand estate, and that she would spend it entirely alone, that there would be no tender words or gentle touches or any of the intimacy she had read about in books and heard whispered about by married women, because the man she had just wed had made it abundantly clear that he wanted nothing from her except her name on a marriage certificate and her cooperation in maintaining the fiction that they were anything more to each other than legal strangers sharing a house. She did not weep, though tears pressed behind her eyes. Instead, she allowed her new lady's maid, a competent woman named Martha, who had been assigned to her to help her out of her wedding dress and into an evening gown of emerald silk, to arrange her hair in a style more elaborate than she had ever worn, and when she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw a woman who appeared every inch the Viscountess, beautiful and elegant and perfectly composed, with only her eyes betraying the desolation that filled her heart. Dinner was served in a dining room so vast that she and Edmund sat at opposite ends of a table that could easily accommodate 20, separated by an expanse of polished mahogany and elaborate silver candelabra, and they ate course after course of exquisitely prepared food that Eleanor could barely taste, while making stilted conversation about the estate and the weather, and nothing whatsoever of any significance. And when the meal finally, mercifully concluded, Edmund rose and informed her that he had urgent correspondence to attend to and bid her good night with a formal bow, and Eleanor returned to her solitary chamber and lay awake in her grand four-poster bed, listening to the silence of Hartley Hall and wondering how it was possible to feel so utterly alone while surrounded by such abundance. Weeks passed in a rhythm of such profound loneliness that Eleanor sometimes wondered if she had become a ghost, haunting the grand corridors of Hartley Hall, visible to the servants who curtsied and called her "my lady," but utterly invisible to the one person whose acknowledgement she craved, whose presence in her life remained as formal and distant as it had been the day they. Wednesday, she rose each morning in her solitary chamber, breakfasted alone in the small morning room that Mrs. Daventry had designated for her personal use, and then set about exploring the vast estate that was now technically her home, but felt no more hers than if she had been a paying guest at an inn, walking through rooms so perfectly appointed and maintained that they seemed like museum displays rather than spaces meant for living, touching beautiful objects with tentative fingers and feeling like an intruder in her own house. The grounds became her refuge, the only place where she felt she could breathe without the weight of all that cold perfection pressing down upon her, and she discovered gardens that had once been magnificent but now showed signs of neglect. Not ruin, for the staff maintained them adequately, but the kind of gentle decline that comes when no one who truly cares tends them, when gardeners follow instructions, but no guiding passion shapes their work. There was a rose garden in particular, situated beyond the south terrace and enclosed by ancient stone walls, where dozens of varieties had been planted in what must have been a glorious profusion of color and scent, but now the beds wanted weeding, the roses needed proper pruning, and the whole space had an air of melancholy abandonment that resonated with something in Eleanor's own heart, as though she and this garden were kindred spirits, both neglected and forgotten despite being surrounded by abundance. Dinners remained an ordeal of formal silence, she and Edmund seated at opposite ends of that interminable table, while servants brought course after course of food she barely tasted, and any attempts at conversation beyond the most banal observations about weather or estate business died quickly, strangled by Edmund's monosyllabic responses and the rigid set of his shoulders that declared more clearly than words that he had no interest in anything approaching intimacy, even the simple intimacy of genuine conversation. He was unfailingly polite, always rose when she entered a room, always inquired after her comfort and whether she had everything she required, but his pale blue eyes, when they rested on her, which was rarely and only briefly, held no warmth, no curiosity, no interest whatsoever, as though she were a responsibility he had undertaken and discharged and now need think of no further. She observed him from a distance, catching glimpses of him riding out early each morning to inspect the farms and meet with tenants, seeing him in his study bent over ledgers and correspondence with that same meticulous attention he brought to everything, noting the respect with which the servants spoke of him and the efficiency with which the entire vast machinery of the estate operated under his management, and understood that whatever else Edmund Hartley might be, he was neither lazy nor careless, in that he took his responsibilities with utmost seriousness, even if his responsibilities apparently did not extend to acknowledging his wife's existence beyond the bare minimum courtesy required. It was during one of her explorations of the house that she discovered the locked music room on the second floor of the west wing, a set of double doors of polished walnut that refused to open when she tried them, and when she inquired of Mrs. Daventry, the housekeeper's expression had shuttered completely, and she said only that his lordship kept that room locked and preferred it remain so, in a tone that made clear the subject was not open for discussion. But then one morning, perhaps 3 weeks after their wedding, Eleanor entered the library, a magnificent 2-story room lined with thousands of books that had quickly become her favorite sanctuary, and discovered that the shelves had been augmented with new volumes, dozens of them, and when she examined them with wonder and growing bewilderment, she realized they were all recently published novels and poetry collections, the very sorts of books she loved best. And when she asked Mrs. Daventry about them, the housekeeper said that his lordship had arranged for them to be sent from London, had apparently instructed his bookseller to provide a selection of the latest literary works that might appeal to Lady Hartley's tastes. And Eleanor stood there among the new books with tears pricking her eyes, because it was such a small gesture, really, merely ensuring the library was stocked with reading material, but it was also the first indication that Edmund had thought about her at all, had considered what might bring her pleasure, and had acted upon that consideration, and she did not know what to make of this man, who would not speak to her beyond cold courtesy, but who somehow knew what books she would love, and made certain she had them. Eleanor's understanding of her husband began to shift not through any grand gesture or dramatic revelation, but through small observations accumulated over days and weeks like snow gathering on a windowsill, each flake insignificant alone but together, creating something substantial enough to notice. She witnessed him one December morning from the library window as he spoke with the Brennan family, tenant farmers whose eldest son had taken ill, and though she could not hear the words exchanged, she saw Edmund's posture lose some of its characteristic rigidity, saw him crouch down to speak directly to the youngest Brennan child, who clutched her father's hand, saw him place what must have been coins into Mrs. Brennan's palm and close her fingers over them when she tried to refuse, and the tenderness of that gesture, the gentle insistence that they accept his help, contradicted so completely the cold, formal man who sat opposite her at dinner that Eleanor found herself wondering which version was the mask and which the truth. The servant spoke of him with respect that held no trace of fear, and Martha, her lady's maid, let slip one morning while dressing Eleanor's hair that his lordship had personally ensured that old Thomas the groundskeeper could remain in his cottage even after his hands became too gnarled with arthritis to work, and that Edmund had quietly arranged for Thomas's grandson to take the position while the old man lived out his days in comfort and dignity. And this too seemed at odds with the man who could barely meet Eleanor's eyes across the dining table. It was perhaps a fortnight after she had discovered the new books in the library that Eleanor encountered Edmund in that very room, quite by accident, for he rarely entered it during the day, and she had thought herself alone when she climbed the rolling ladder to reach a volume of Wordsworth on an upper shelf. But when she descended with her prize clutched to her chest, she found him standing near the fireplace with a book of his own in hand, and they both startled like deer surprised in a forest clearing. "Lady Hartley," he said with that automatic formality, inclining his head, but his eyes went to the volume she held, and something flickered across his features, interest perhaps, or recognition. "Wordsworth," he observed, and it was not quite a question. "Yes," Eleanor replied, her heart beating faster for reasons she could not name. "I find his observations on nature particularly moving, the way he sees divinity in ordinary landscapes." Edmund was silent for a moment, his pale blue eyes still fixed on the book in her hands, and then he said quietly, "I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills," quoting the opening of one of Wordsworth's most famous pieces, and Eleanor felt something catch in her chest, because his voice, when he spoke those lines, lost its usual rigid formality and became something softer, almost wistful, as though the poetry reached some part of him that his daily armor did not protect. "You know his work," she said, and immediately felt foolish for stating the obvious, but Edmund nodded. "My mother read it to me," he said, and then seemed to realize what he had revealed, for his expression shuttered immediately, and he took a step backward. "I hope you find the library adequately stocked. If there are other volumes you require, you need only inform Mrs. Daventry." And before Eleanor could respond, before she could ask about his mother or poetry or anything that might prolong this first real conversation they had ever had, he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click that somehow felt louder than a slam. But Eleanor stood there holding Wordsworth to her chest and thinking about the way Edmund's voice had changed when he quoted those lines, about the flicker of something vulnerable that had crossed his face when he mentioned his mother, and her curiosity about the walls he had built around himself intensified into something approaching determination, a need to understand what had made this man so afraid of connection that he would deny himself even simple conversation. It was Mrs. Daventry who, perhaps intentionally or perhaps merely caught in an unguarded moment, provided the next piece of the puzzle when Eleanor asked about the locked music room, pressing the question more firmly than she had before. "It was her ladyship's room," the housekeeper said finally, her stern features softening slightly. "The late Viscountess, his lordship's mother. She was a great musician, played pianoforte beautifully, and that was her private sanctuary. She died when his lordship was but 12 years old, and he's kept it locked ever since." The housekeeper paused, seeming to weigh how much to say, then added quietly, "It was not a happy house, my lady," before she passed. The old Viscount was a hard man, cold and exacting. Her music was the only warmth in these halls, and when it stopped, she did not finish the sentence, but Eleanor understood, and suddenly Edmund's rigid control and careful distance made a terrible kind of sense. He was his father's son, raised in coldness, and perhaps he knew no other way to be. The storm arrived on a Tuesday evening in late December, one of those furious winter tempests that seemed to rise from nowhere, transforming a grey afternoon into a howling darkness of wind and freezing rain that lashed against the windows of Hartley Hall with such violence that Eleanor could hear it even in the drawing-room where she sat attempting to read by firelight. And when the dinner hour arrived, she made her way to the dining-room, expecting the usual frigid formality, but found instead that the storm had somehow altered the very atmosphere of the house, as though the wildness outside had breached the careful control within. Edmund was already seated, but instead of maintaining his position at the distant head of the table, he had moved to a chair much closer to where Eleanor customarily sat, and when she entered, he rose with his habitual courtesy. But there was something different in his expression, a restlessness perhaps, or maybe the storm had unsettled him as it had her, making the vast formal dining room with its echoing spaces seem ridiculous and unnecessary. And when she took her seat, he did not immediately retreat into silence, but instead asked, his voice awkward as though unpracticed at genuine inquiry, whether the storm had frightened her, whether her chambers were adequately warm, whether she had been comfortable during her time at Hartley Hall. Eleanor, surprised by this unprecedented attention, answered honestly that she had been perfectly comfortable in material terms, that the house was magnificent and the servants attentive, and then, emboldened by something in his manner, or perhaps by the intimacy created by the storm raging beyond the walls, she added that she had found great pleasure in exploring the gardens, despite their neglected state, particularly the rose garden beyond the south terrace, and she watched as Edmund's pale blue eyes focused on her with what seemed like genuine interest rather than mere politeness. "The rose garden," he repeated, and something like pain flickered across his features. "My mother's particular pride. She spent hours there when weather permitted, and I—" He stopped abruptly, as though catching himself in an unwanted revelation, but Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her heart beating faster, and said softly that Mrs. Daventry had mentioned his mother's love of beauty, and that the garden, even in its current state, showed evidence of exquisite original design. And then, hardly daring to hope but unable to stop herself, she said that she would very much like to restore it if his lordship had no objection, that she had some knowledge of horticulture, and it would give her purpose and pleasure to bring the roses back to their former glory. The silence that followed stretched so long that Eleanor feared she had overstepped, had presumed too much or touched some nerve too tender to bear contact. But then Edmund did something extraordinary. He smiled, not the tight formal expression he occasionally deployed as courtesy demanded, but a real smile that softened his entire countenance and reached his eyes, transforming him momentarily into someone younger and less burdened. And he said quietly that nothing would please him more than to see the garden restored, that his mother would have loved knowing someone cared for her roses again, and he would arrange for whatever resources Eleanor required, gardeners and supplies and anything she deemed necessary. From that evening forward, something shifted between them, subtle as spring's first thaw but undeniable, and Eleanor threw herself into the garden project with passionate dedication, spending her mornings consulting with the head gardener and her afternoons actually working among the roses herself, despite Martha's scandalized protests that ladies did not dig in the dirt, and sometimes when she was kneeling in the cold earth with soil under her fingernails and her old dress stained with mud, she would feel eyes upon her and look up to find Edmund standing at his study window watching her, his expression unreadable at that distance, but his attention unmistakable, and their morning encounters in the corridors began to include actual exchanges beyond mere formality, inquiries about the garden's progress, and Eleanor's observations about which varieties seemed most hardy, and once, gloriously, she discovered Edmund in the library, reading one of the novels she had recently finished and left on the side table, and when their eyes met, he did not make excuses or deny it, but simply inclined his head in acknowledgement, and Eleanor felt something warm and fragile begin to unfurl in her chest, like the first green shoot pushing through winter soil, tentative and vulnerable, but unmistakably alive. Autumn arrived with that particular golden quality of light that transforms the English countryside into something almost ethereal, and with it came a deepening of the connection between Eleanor and Edmund that seemed to grow as naturally and inevitably as the changing of the seasons themselves. Beginning one crisp October morning when Eleanor, wrapped in her warmest cloak and venturing out to inspect the progress of the rose garden, found Edmund already there, standing among the newly pruned bushes with his hands clasped behind his back, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air, and when he turned at the sound of her approach, his expression held not the usual wariness but something almost sheepish, and he said quietly that he had hoped she might permit him to accompany her on her morning inspection, that he found himself curious about the work she was doing and would value her explanations of the process. And Eleanor, her heart lifting with surprised pleasure, agreed immediately, and thus began a ritual that would define the following weeks their morning walks through the grounds, sometimes to the rose garden but often ranging farther, along the tree-lined paths that bordered the estate or through the orchards where apples hung heavy and ripe. And during these walks they talked, hesitantly at first but with growing ease, about matters both practical and philosophical, about the tenant families and their needs, about improvements Edmund was considering for the estate's drainage systems, about books they had read and ideas they had encountered, and Eleanor discovered that her husband possessed a keen intelligence and a thoughtfulness that his rigid formality had completely obscured, and more than once she found herself offering suggestions about tenant welfare, perhaps a school for the children, or improvements to the cottages that housed the families who worked the land. And to her amazement, Edmund not only listened but actually implemented several of her ideas, arranging for repairs to the Brennan family's roof and establishing a small fund for educational materials. And when she thanked him for considering her opinions, he had looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch, and said simply that her observations were sound and her compassion admirable, and he would be a fool not to value her counsel. As November brought preparations for Christmas, Eleanor found herself working alongside Edmund with increasing frequency, planning the traditional celebrations for the household and tenants, and there came an afternoon when they stood together in the great hall, directing the placement of greenery, holly and ivy brought in from the estate's woods, and Eleanor reached up to adjust a particularly stubborn branch. At the same moment Edmund did, and their hands touched, fingers brushing against each other with an electric quality that seemed entirely disproportionate to the innocence of the contact. And for one suspended moment they both froze, hands still touching, eyes meeting, and Eleanor saw something kindle in Edmund's expression, something warm and almost desperate. But then he stepped back abruptly, his face shuttering closed with such speed that she might have imagined that flicker of longing, and he excused himself with rigid formality and left her standing there with her hand still raised and her heart hammering against her ribs, confused and aching with a want she was only beginning to acknowledge, because somewhere in these weeks of morning walks and thoughtful conversations and small shared moments, she had done the most foolish thing imaginable. She had begun to fall in love with her husband, this complicated, guarded man who showed her glimpses of warmth and depth, only to retreat behind his walls again. And she did not know whether his withdrawals meant indifference or fear, whether she was alone in this growing feeling, or whether he too felt the pull between them and simply lacked the courage or desire to act upon it, and the uncertainty was exquisite torment. Edmund stood at the window of his study that evening, watching darkness settle over the grounds where Eleanor had worked that afternoon, and felt the familiar tightening in his chest that had become his constant companion these recent weeks, a sensation that was equal parts longing and terror, desire and dread, and he pressed his forehead against the cold glass as though the chill might shock some sense back into him, might freeze out the warmth that had been steadily, inexorably seeping into the carefully ordered fortress he had constructed around his heart. He had not meant for this to happen. God knew he had not meant for any of this to happen, and yet somewhere between the formal arrangement he had so carefully negotiated and this present moment, something had shifted fundamentally, and he could no longer deny, at least to himself in the privacy of his own mind, that Eleanor had become far more to him than simply the wife his uncle's cursed will had required him to take, more than the sensible solution to an inheritance problem, more than the quiet presence who had agreed to occupy one wing of his house while he occupied another in their carefully segregated lives. She had become the first thing he thought of upon waking, and the last image in his mind before sleep, had become the person whose opinion he valued above all others, whose smile could transform his entire day, whose presence in a room made the air itself seem different, charged with possibilities both wonderful and terrifying, and this realization filled him with a panic so profound that sometimes he could barely breathe beneath its weight, because he had sworn to himself with iron determination after watching his parents destroy each other in their own arranged marriage, that he would never allow himself to become vulnerable in this way, would never grant another person the power to wound him, would never risk the kind of soul-deep misery he had witnessed throughout his childhood, in that house where his father's coldness and his mother's desperate unhappiness had created an atmosphere so toxic that even now, decades later, he could still feel its poison in his veins. His parents had been an arrangement too, a marriage negotiated for property and position, and he had watched his mother wither like a plant denied sunlight. He had seen her retreat into her music room and her gardens seeking beauty his father would never provide, had witnessed his father's contempt for what he called her weaknesses, her emotions, her needs, her very existence, and Edmund had learned early that love was dangerous, that opening one's heart was an invitation to suffering, that safety lay in distance and control and the careful management of all feeling, and when his uncle's will had forced him into this marriage, he had raged against it precisely because it threatened to crack the protective walls he had spent years perfecting. But Eleanor, with her quiet dignity and unexpected strength, with her intelligence and her kindness to the tenants, and with the way she transformed the gardens and filled the library with her presence, and never once demanded more than he had offered in their original agreement, Eleanor had somehow slipped past his defenses without him even realizing it was happening, and now he stood at this window, watching the shadows swallow the rose garden she had restored, and felt himself being pulled towards something that terrified him more than anything else in his carefully ordered life, felt the walls he had built beginning to crumble, and his determination to maintain distance was engaged in brutal warfare with his desperate desire to surrender, to give in, to walk to her chambers right now and tell her everything he felt. And yet how could he do that to her? How could he trap her in the kind of marriage his parents had endured? How could he burden her with feelings she might not return, might never return? And so he stood frozen between want and fear, between the man he had trained himself to be and the man he was terrified he might become if he allowed himself to love her. And in that moment, Edmund Hartley, Viscount Hartley, master of a vast estate and commander of considerable fortune, felt more powerless than he had ever felt in his life, because the one thing he wanted most in the world was the one thing he was most afraid to reach for, and he did not know how much longer he could sustain this internal battle before something inside him simply broke. The snowstorm arrived in mid-December with a ferocity that caught even the most experienced residents of the county by surprise, transforming the landscape into an impenetrable white wilderness within hours, and effectively trapping Edmund and Eleanor within Hartley Hall for what would stretch into nearly a week of forced proximity that would alter the careful distance they had maintained. And it began the first evening when Mrs. Daventry apologetically informed them that the servants' wing was suffering from a smoking chimney, and she had taken the liberty of having dinner laid in the smaller drawing room where a good fire was already blazing, and thus Eleanor found herself seated across from Edmund in a room far more intimate than the formal dining hall they usually occupied, the firelight casting dancing shadows across his features and creating an atmosphere that seemed to invite confidences. And perhaps it was the wine Edmund poured with uncharacteristic generosity, or perhaps it was simply that the storm raging outside made the wider world feel very far away, and this small circle of warmth and light feel like its own protected universe. But when Edmund asked her, really asked her, with genuine curiosity, warming his voice about her childhood, about her dreams, before circumstance had narrowed her options, Eleanor found herself answering with an honesty she had not intended, telling him about the books that had been her escape from her father's increasing desperation, about the imaginary worlds she had constructed in the crumbling library of her family's estate, about her foolish, girlish dreams of adventure and romance, and a life larger than the constrained existence that poverty and gender had seemed to promise her. And Edmund listened with an intensity that made her feel truly seen, truly heard, perhaps for the first time in her life. And when she faltered, embarrassed by her own revelations, he said quietly that there was nothing foolish about wanting beauty and meaning in one's life, that he thought her dreams rather wonderful, actually. And then, as though her honesty had unlocked something in him, he began to speak about his own youth, haltingly at first but with growing fluency, about the coldness of his childhood home, about his mother's melancholy and his father's contempt, about the music room where his mother had retreated and which he had locked after her death because he could not bear the memories it contained. And Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as she understood for the first time the depths of loneliness and pain that had shaped this guarded man. And she reached across the small space between their chairs and touched his hand, just briefly, just a moment of connection, and he did not pull away. The following days developed a rhythm that felt almost dreamlike in its departure, from their usual careful separation mornings spent in the library where Edmund taught Eleanor chess, with a patience that surprised them both, afternoons reading in companionable silence by the fire, evenings talking over wine and dinner about everything and nothing, philosophy and poetry and politics, and there were moments of laughter, actual laughter that seemed to startle them both with its rarity and preciousness. And on the fourth night, when Eleanor beat him at chess for the first time, he threw back his head and laughed with such genuine delight that she felt something crack open in her chest, felt her love for him expand until it was almost painful in its intensity. And later that same evening, as they stood together at the window watching snow fall in the darkness, standing so close that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, Edmund turned to her and she turned to him, and their eyes met and held, and she saw his gaze drop to her lips and felt her own breath catch, and he leaned toward her, slowly, giving her every opportunity to retreat, and she swayed toward him in answer, her heart hammering, her lips parting slightly, and they were a breath apart, less than a breath, when the drawing-room door opened, and Mrs. Daventry entered with the tea-tray, and the spell shattered, and Edmund stepped back so quickly he nearly stumbled, and the shutters came down over his expression with devastating speed, and he excused himself with rigid formality and left Eleanor standing at the window, with her hand pressed to her chest, and her mind reeling with confusion and hurt, and the terrible certainty that he had been about to kiss her, and he had wanted to kiss her, and yet had fled as though from mortal danger, and she did not understand, could not understand, why he kept retreating just when they seemed on the verge of something real. Spring arrived at Hartley Hall with an explosion of green and gold that seemed to mock the careful distance Edmund had reimposed between himself and Eleanor, following that night when they had nearly kissed, when he had nearly surrendered to the feelings he could no longer deny but still refused to acknowledge, and in the weeks that followed the snowstorm's end, he had retreated behind walls of formality, even more rigid than those that had existed at the beginning of their marriage. And Eleanor, confused and hurt by his withdrawal yet too proud to demand explanations, had matched his coolness with her own careful politeness, and thus they had drifted through February and March in a state of exquisite mutual misery, speaking only when necessary, taking meals in silence, avoiding each other's eyes, and it was therefore with considerable surprise that Eleanor received Edmund's message in early April that business required his presence in London to finalize certain legal matters related to the estate, and that he insisted the word was underlined twice in his note that she accompany him on the journey. And when she had asked Mrs. Daventry whether the housekeeper knew why Lord Hartley would require her presence for what was surely tedious legal business, the older woman had given her a look that suggested she knew far more than she was saying, and murmured that perhaps his lordship simply wished for company on the long journey, and Eleanor had not known what to make of this but had agreed nonetheless, and thus on a mild April morning she found herself seated across from Edmund in the luxurious confines of the Hartley carriage as it rolled southward toward London through countryside, alive with spring flowers and birdsong that seemed to emphasize the strained silence within. Edmund had handed her into the carriage with more care than was strictly necessary, his hand lingering on hers for just a moment longer than required, and she had noticed that he sat not in the corner farthest from her, as she might have expected, but rather in the seat directly across where he could see her face, And throughout the morning as they traveled, he watched her with an intensity that was almost unnerving, and when the carriage jolted over a rough patch of road and she was thrown slightly forward, his hand shot out to steady her with reflexive protectiveness, and he did not immediately withdraw his touch. And Eleanor felt her heart begin to race at this small gesture that suggested perhaps his coldness masked something quite different, perhaps feelings he was fighting rather than feelings he did not possess. They stopped for the night at a coaching inn of respectable quality, and Edmund secured rooms for them with meticulous attention to propriety, booking a private dining parlour where they shared dinner in an atmosphere thick with unspoken words, and Eleanor noticed that he filled her wineglass with unusual frequency, and his own as well, as though seeking courage from the bottle. And over the meal he asked her questions about her work in the gardens, about her reading, about her opinions on matters of estate management, and he listened to her answers with that same intense focus she had observed during the snowstorm. And there were moments when their eyes would meet and hold, and she could see something almost desperate in his gaze, something that made her breath catch and her pulse quicken. And when the meal concluded, and Edmund escorted her to her chamber door, he stood in the hallway for a long moment, as though wrestling with some internal debate, and his hand rose as if to touch her face, and she stood very still, barely breathing, willing him to bridge the distance between them, to explain his contradictions, to tell her what it was that made him look at her as though she were precious beyond measure while maintaining this maddening formality. But then something shifted in his expression. Some wall came down or came up, she could not tell which, and he bowed with rigid correctness and bid her good night, and retreated to his own room, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the dim corridor, with her hand pressed against her racing heart and tears of frustration burning behind her eyes, because she was tired, so desperately tired, of this dance they were performing, this advance and retreat that was slowly tearing her apart. And as she prepared for bed, she resolved that she would demand answers, would force this conversation they had been avoiding, would not let him hide any more behind politeness and propriety, because whatever was or was not between them, whatever feelings he did or did not harbor, she deserved to know the truth rather than exist in this agonizing uncertainty. And tomorrow, she promised herself, tomorrow when they reached London and completed his business, she would find her courage and ask him directly what she had become to him, beyond simply the wife his uncle's will had required him to take. And with this resolution, she finally slept, unaware that by the next evening, everything between them would be transformed in ways she could not possibly anticipate. That crisis was approaching on a lonely road and would force into the open all the truths they had been so carefully concealing. The morning dawned clear and mild as they departed the coaching inn, Edmund handing Eleanor into the carriage with that same careful attention she had observed the previous day, his hand lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary on hers, his eyes searching her face as though committing it to memory, though she could not have known why such intensity shadowed his gaze, could not have guessed at the strange premonition that had troubled his sleep and made him suddenly, urgently grateful for every moment in her presence. And they had been traveling perhaps 2 hours along an increasingly isolated stretch of road that wound through dense woodland, when the carriage lurched to an abrupt halt, and Edmund's expression shifted instantly from contemplative to alert, his body tensing in a way that made Eleanor's heart begin to race even before she heard the coachman's shout of alarm. And then they appeared as if materializing from the very trees themselves, 4 men on horseback, faces obscured by dark scarves, the pistols gleaming in the spring sunlight, and Eleanor felt terror flood through her veins as she understood with crystalline clarity that they were being robbed. And Edmund moved with reflexive speed, positioning himself between her and the carriage door, his arm extending across her body in a gesture of protection that was as unconscious as breathing. And his voice when he spoke was perfectly calm, perfectly cold, the voice of a man who had spent a lifetime mastering his reactions and would not show fear even in the face of mortal danger. The leader of the bandits dismounted and approached the carriage with insolent confidence, his pistol held with the casual ease of one accustomed to violence, and he demanded their valuables in tones that carried the edge of cruelty, and Edmund replied with icy civility that they would surrender their possessions without resistance, and there need be no violence, and he removed his pocket watch and the ring from his finger and handed them through the window while keeping his body positioned protectively before Eleanor, and when the bandit demanded Eleanor's jewelry, Edmund's jaw tightened, but he turned to help her remove her necklace and earrings, his fingers brushing her neck with infinite gentleness that contrasted starkly with the violence humming in the air around them. And Eleanor was trembling but trying desperately not to show it, trying to match Edmund's composure even as terror clawed at her throat. And for a moment it seemed the ordeal might end without worse harm, that the bandits would take their plunder and disappear back into the forest, but then the leader's eyes fixed on Eleanor with an attention that made her skin crawl, and he said something crude about pretty ladies and whether perhaps she might fetch a ransom far greater than mere jewels. And Edmund's composure shattered like glass, and he leaned out of the carriage window, despite Eleanor's gasped protest, and told the man in tones of absolute frost that he would die before allowing anyone to touch his wife, and Eleanor heard the possessiveness in those words. His wife, said with a fury and protectiveness that transcended mere duty or honor, and the bandit laughed, a sound without humor, and raised his pistol with deliberate menace, and pointed it not at Edmund, but at Eleanor, and time seemed to slow and crystallize as Edmund's eyes met hers for one eternal moment that contained everything they had never said to each other, every feeling they had hidden and denied, and she saw love there, blazing and undeniable, saw it as clearly as if he had shouted it. And then Edmund moved. He moved with a speed that seemed impossible, lunging across the carriage interior, even as the bandit's finger tightened on the trigger. And Eleanor's scream was already forming in her throat when the pistol discharged, with a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of the world, a crack of thunder that echoed through the quiet woodland and sent birds exploding from the trees in terrified flight. And Edmund's body collided with hers, bearing her backward against the carriage seat, his arms wrapped around her in absolute protection. And for one suspended heartbeat, Eleanor did not understand what had happened, knew only that Edmund was holding her with desperate strength, that his breath was hot against her neck, that his weight pressed her down as though he would shield her from the world itself. And then she felt the wetness spreading between them, warm and terrible, and Edmund made a sound that was half gasp and half groan, and when he tried to straighten his face had gone chalk white, and his left arm hung useless at his side. And blood, so much blood was spreading across his coat in a dark stain that seemed to grow even as she watched in horror, and Eleanor's scream, when it finally came, was a sound of pure anguish, as she understood with sickening clarity that Edmund had taken the bullet meant for her, had deliberately put his body between her and death, and he was looking at her with eyes that struggled to focus, and his right hand came up to touch her face with infinite tenderness, and he whispered her name like a prayer before his strength failed, and he collapsed against her, and she caught him as best she could, her hands frantically pressing against the wound in his shoulder, even as blood welled hot and terrifying between her fingers, and she was dimly aware of chaos erupting outside the carriage. The coachman had produced a blunderbuss from beneath his seat and fired into the air, and the bandits' horses reared and panicked, and perhaps they had not expected real resistance, or perhaps the sight of actual bloodshed cooled their appetite for violence. But they wheeled their mounts and disappeared into the forest as quickly as they had come, leaving Eleanor alone, with Edmund's bleeding body and terror such as she had never known, and she was crying his name, begging him to stay with her, to hold on, and his eyes fluttered open and found hers, and she saw love there, naked and undeniable, saw everything he had been hiding blazing in his gaze, and he tried to speak but could only manage a whisper that she had to lean close to hear, and what he said was, "Forgive me, should have told you, love you, always loved you." And then his eyes rolled back, and his body went limp in her arms, and Eleanor's world contracted to this single terrible moment, to the weight of him against her, to the blood that covered them both, to the frantic pressure of her hands against his wound, and her voice screaming for help, screaming for someone to save him, screaming until her throat was raw, because she could not lose him now. Not now when she finally understood, not when she had just discovered that the feelings she had been nurturing in secret were returned, as had perhaps always been returned, and the coachman was at the door, his face pale with shock, and Eleanor was giving orders through her tears. "Drive, drive now, find help. There must be an estate nearby, a doctor, something, someone." And she would not let Edmund die, would not accept that possibility, would hold him and keep him breathing through sheer force of will if necessary, and as the carriage lurched into motion, she cradled his unconscious form against her heart and prayed to every deity she could name that she would be given the chance to tell him that she loved him too, that she had been falling for him across all these months of careful distance and stolen glances, and that if he would only live, only survive this, she would spend the rest of her life showing him what he meant to her, and this she promised to the universe as Edmund's blood soaked her dress and the miles rolled past in an agony of desperate hope. The carriage rattled over rutted roads with a violence that made Edmund groan even in unconsciousness, and Eleanor held him against her with strength she had not known she possessed. One hand pressed with desperate firmness against the wound that would not stop bleeding, her dress soaked crimson, her arms aching with the effort of keeping him steady as the miles blurred past in an agony of terror and hope, and she spoke to him constantly, though he could not hear, telling him to hold on, that she needed him, that he could not leave her now, and his face was the color of parchment, his breathing shallow and labored, and twice she thought he had stopped breathing entirely, and her own heart seemed to cease until she felt the faint flutter of pulse at his throat and could breathe again herself. And when the coachman shouted that he could see an estate ahead, Eleanor wanted to weep with relief, but there was no time for tears, only for action, and the carriage careened up a long drive and came to a halt before a substantial manor house, and Eleanor was shouting for help before the wheels had fully stopped. And then there were people servants rushing out in alarm, a grey-haired gentleman who took one look at Edmund's limp form and the blood and immediately began giving crisp orders, and Eleanor found herself swept up in a flurry of activity as Edmund was carried inside and laid upon a sofa in the drawing-room because there was no time to take him upstairs, and the gentleman introduced himself as Sir Robert Pemberton, and assured Eleanor that his own physician lived but 2 miles distant and was already being summoned, and Eleanor should have felt comforted, but she could not leave Edmund's side, could not stop touching him, his face, his hair, his hand, as though her touch alone could tether him to life, and Lady Pemberton appeared with warm water and clean cloths, and gently urged Eleanor to let her tend the wound, but Eleanor refused to relinquish her post, and together they worked to cut away Edmund's ruined coat and shirt, and the sight of the wound made Eleanor's stomach turn a dark hole in his shoulder, still welling blood and the flesh around it, angry and torn, and Lady Pemberton's face was grave, but she said nothing discouraging, only pressed fresh cloths against the injury and told Eleanor to keep pressure steady, and the minutes dragged like hours until finally the doctor arrived, a brisk, efficient man who took one look at Edmund and immediately set to work, and he told Eleanor she must leave the room, that what he had to do was not fit for a lady's eyes. But Eleanor met his gaze with steel she had not known she possessed, and told him she would not leave her husband, and something in her voice must have convinced him, because he nodded shortly and began laying out his instruments, and Eleanor held Edmund's hand, his right hand, the left arm being damaged, and watched as the doctor probed the wound for the bullet, and Edmund remained mercifully unconscious, though his body jerked and twisted with the pain, and Eleanor had to turn away when the doctor extracted the metal ball, slick with blood, but she heard his grunt of satisfaction and dared to hope, and then there was the careful work of cleaning and stitching, and through it all Eleanor held Edmund's hand and prayed, and finally the doctor straightened and wiped his hands and told her that the bullet had missed the major vessels, and if infection did not set in, her husband might yet recover, though the next days would be critical and fever was almost certain, and Eleanor nodded, understanding, though terror still gripped her heart. And when Edmund was finally bandaged and settled and carried upstairs to a guest chamber, Eleanor followed like a shadow, and when they laid him on the bed, she sank into the chair beside him and took his hand again, and would not be moved, not for food or rest or the concerned suggestions of Lady Pemberton, and as afternoon faded to evening and evening to night, Eleanor kept her vigil, watching the too pale face of her husband, watching the shallow rise and fall of his chest, and once in the deep hours of night his eyes fluttered open briefly and found hers, and he whispered her name like a benediction, and then, "Forgive me. Should have told you." And she leaned close and whispered back, "There is nothing to forgive, only get well, please get well." But she did not know if he heard before darkness claimed him again. The fever came that night with a vengeance that made the doctor shake his head gravely and speak in low tones to Lady Pemberton about the dangers ahead, and Eleanor heard the words, infection, and critical hours, and felt her heart constrict with terror, even as she pressed cool cloths to Edmund's burning forehead and whispered reassurances she desperately needed to believe herself. And for 3 days and 3 nights Edmund existed in a twilight realm between consciousness and delirium, his body burning with heat that seemed impossible for a human form to contain. And Eleanor never left his side except when Lady Pemberton absolutely insisted she take a few moments to wash or change her blood-stained dress, and even then she rushed back within minutes, as though Edmund might slip away in her absence. And it was during those fever-haunted hours that Edmund's carefully constructed walls finally crumbled completely, and the things he said in his delirium laid bare a heart Eleanor had only glimpsed in fragments. And the first night when the fever was at its height, he thrashed against the pillows and cried out her name with such anguish that Eleanor had to grip his hand tightly and tell him she was there, she was safe, and his eyes opened but did not see her, looked through her to some terrible vision, and he said, "Couldn't lose you, would rather die. Don't you understand? I would rather die." And his voice broke on the words, and Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as she understood with perfect clarity what he had been hiding, and she leaned close and whispered, "I'm here, I'm safe, you saved me." But he could not hear her through the fever's grip. And the second night he spoke of his childhood, fragmented memories of a cold father and a mother who had died when he was young, and he said, "Promised myself, never feel this, too dangerous to love, hurts too much when they leave." And Eleanor pressed kisses to his burning hand and ached for the boy he had been and the man he had become, so determined to protect himself that he had built a prison of loneliness. And she whispered back, though he could not hear, "I won't leave you. I swear I won't leave you." And on the third night, when the fever reached its crisis point, and the doctor told Eleanor gently that she should prepare herself for the worst, that sometimes, despite all efforts, the body simply could not fight, Eleanor refused to accept those words, refused to believe that having finally understood Edmund's heart she would lose him, and she sat by his bedside through those darkest hours before dawn, and held his hand and prayed with an intensity that felt like bargaining with God himself. And she made promises that if Edmund lived, she would spend every day showing him he was loved, that she would tear down his walls with patience and tenderness, that she would make him understand that loving her was not the terrible risk he feared, but rather the safest thing in the world, because she would never, ever leave him. And Edmund's breathing grew more labored, and his skin burned with heat that frightened her, and twice his body convulsed with seizures that made Eleanor cry out for help. And the doctor came and did what he could, and shook his head gravely, and left Eleanor alone with her dying husband. And she laid her head on the bed beside Edmund's hand, and wept because she could not bear this, and could not endure losing him when she had only just found him. And she whispered brokenly, "Please don't go. Please. I love you. Do you hear me? I love you, and I need you to stay. I need you to fight." And just as she thought she could bear no more, just as the first pale fingers of dawn began to creep through the window, Edmund's breathing changed, became deeper and more regular, and when Eleanor lifted her head with desperate hope and pressed her hand to his forehead, the terrible burning heat had finally, miraculously broken, and Edmund slept peacefully for the first time in 3 days, and Eleanor collapsed beside him and sobbed with relief so profound it felt like resurrection. Edmund woke to silence and the pale gold light of afternoon streaming through unfamiliar windows, and for a long moment he could not remember where he was or why his left shoulder throbbed with an ache so profound it seemed to pulse through his entire body. And then memory returned in fragments: the bandits, the pistol raised toward Eleanor, his own body moving before thought could intervene, in the explosion of pain and darkness, and his first instinct was panic, because Eleanor, where was Eleanor? Was she safe? And he tried to sit up, but his body refused to obey, and a groan escaped him before he could stop it, and then he turned his head and saw her, and the sight made his chest tighten with an emotion he had no name for, because Eleanor was asleep in the chair beside his bed, her head pillowed on her arms on the edge of the mattress, her face turned toward him, and even in sleep she looked exhausted, dark circles beneath her eyes, her hair falling loose from pins in a way she would never have allowed in normal circumstances, and her dress, he recognized it as the traveling dress she had worn, now wrinkled and stained with what he realized with horror was his own blood, and he understood with sudden clarity that she had not left him, had stayed through whatever nightmare had followed the attack, and something in his carefully constructed armor cracked further, because why would she stay? Why would she care whether he lived or died when he had given her nothing but coldness and distance and the shell of a marriage? And as if sensing his waking, Eleanor's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she looked disoriented, and then her gaze focused on him, and such relief flooded her face that Edmund felt his throat tighten, and she sat up quickly, reaching for his hand, and her voice was rough with exhaustion and emotion as she said, "Edmund, thank God, you're awake, truly awake this time." And he tried to speak, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. "Eleanor, are you hurt? Did they?" And she shook her head quickly, tears already spilling down her cheeks, though she was smiling. No, I'm perfectly well. You saved me. Don't you remember? You stepped in front of me and took the bullet that was meant for me." And Edmund closed his eyes because he did remember that moment of absolute clarity when he had seen the pistol aimed at her and known with perfect certainty that he would die before he let her be harmed. And he had acted on instinct, but it had not been instinct at all. It had been love, the very thing he had sworn never to feel, and now in his weakened state he could not summon the energy to hide it. And when he opened his eyes again, Eleanor was watching him with an expression he could not read, and he said weakly, attempting to retreat into familiar formality even now, "Why are you here, Eleanor? You should be resting, should not trouble yourself." And she interrupted him, her voice suddenly fierce. "Where else would I be, Edmund? You are my husband. You nearly died protecting me. Did you truly think I would leave your side?" And he had no answer for that, because yes, part of him had thought exactly that, had expected her to fulfill whatever minimum duty required and then retreat to safety. And his confusion must have shown on his face, because Eleanor's expression softened, and she said gently, carefully, "You spoke during the fever, Edmund. You said things I need to know if you meant." And panic flooded through him because he had no memory of fevered days, but he could imagine what he might have revealed, and his immediate instinct was to deny, to rebuild the walls. But he was so tired, and she was looking at him with such hope and tenderness, and he realized in that moment that he had a choice. He could continue pretending and condemn them both to the hollow marriage he had designed, or he could risk the truth and perhaps lose everything, but at least die knowing he had been honest. And the word die echoed in his mind, and he thought of how close he had come to leaving this world without ever telling Eleanor what she had come to mean to him, and suddenly the risk of honesty seemed far less frightening than the certainty of continued loneliness. And so Edmund took a shaking breath and met his wife's eyes, and said with halting vulnerability, What did I say?" Eleanor felt her heart hammering in her chest as she looked at Edmund's vulnerable face, at the fear and hope warring in his fever-weakened eyes, and she knew that this moment would define everything that came after, that her answer would either build a bridge between them or leave them stranded forever on opposite shores. And so she took a steadying breath and said softly, her voice trembling with emotion, "You said you would rather die than lose me, that you couldn't bear it if I were hurt. And you spoke of being afraid to love because everyone you loved had left you." And she watched Edmund's eyes close briefly, as if in pain, saw his jaw tighten as he fought for composure even now, and she squeezed his hand gently and continued, "And Edmund, I need you to know, I need you to understand that I love you too, that I have loved you for months now, perhaps from the moment you first smiled at me in the rose garden, or perhaps even before that. In all those small kindnesses, you thought I didn't notice the books in the library chosen specifically for my tastes, the way you implemented every suggestion I made for the tenants, and the way you watched me from your study window when you thought I couldn't see." And Edmund's eyes flew open, startled, and she saw the sheen of tears there, and her own vision blurred as she said, "I fell in love with you gradually, the way spring arrives, so slowly you don't notice until suddenly everything is in bloom, and I have been so lonely, Edmund, wanting to reach you but not knowing how to breach those walls you had built so high." And Edmund made a sound that was half sob, half laugh, and tears spilled down his face, and it was the first time Eleanor had ever seen him cry, the first time she had witnessed this proud and controlled man allow himself such vulnerability, and he said brokenly, "I never wanted to trap you in the kind of marriage my parents had, Eleanor. I watched my mother wither in loneliness because my father could not love her. and I swore I would never inflict that pain on anyone, and so I thought if I kept my distance, if I never allowed myself to feel, then at least I would not hurt you with false promises." And his voice cracked. "But I failed. God help me. I failed because you are so beautiful and kind and intelligent, and every day I found it harder to maintain the pretense of indifference, and every night I lay awake, knowing you were just down the corridor, and I had no right to go to you, no right to tell you that I was falling in love with my own wife." And Eleanor was crying now too, and she leaned forward carefully, mindful of his injury, and cupped his face in her hands and said fiercely, "You have every right, Edmund. You have always had that right. I am your wife, and I want to be your wife in truth, not just in name. And I need you to understand that I am not your mother, and you are not your father. We are ourselves, and we have the power to build something different, something true." And Edmund reached up with his good hand to cover hers, and he whispered, "I love you, Eleanor. I love you so much it terrifies me, and when I saw that pistol aimed at you I knew I would die 1,000 times before I let you be harmed. And I am still afraid, but I am more afraid of losing you by never having told you the truth." And Eleanor smiled through her tears and leaned down and kissed him, soft and tender and full of promise, and it was their first real kiss, not the perfunctory brush of lips at their wedding, but a true meeting of hearts. And despite his weakness, Edmund's hand came up to tangle in her hair, and when they finally parted they were both breathless, and Edmund whispered against her lips, "Promise me you'll stay. Promise me this is real." And Eleanor kissed him again and murmured, "I promise. I swear to you. I will spend the rest of my life proving it to you." And they held each other as afternoon light spilled across them like a blessing, and everything that had been broken between them began, finally, to heal. The weeks of Edmund's recovery unfolded with a tenderness that Eleanor had once thought impossible, and they remained at the estate where they had taken refuge, a modest manor belonging to a distant cousin of Edmund's who had graciously offered his home and discretion. And in those quiet days, while Edmund's shoulder slowly healed, something far more profound mended between them, and Eleanor discovered that caring for Edmund in his vulnerability was not a burden but a gift, because he allowed her to see him completely, without pretense or walls, and she would sit beside him for hours reading aloud, while he listened with eyes closed and a slight smile on his lips, and sometimes he would reach for her hand and simply hold it, as if reassuring himself that she was real and present. And Edmund proved to be a reluctant patient, chafing at his weakness and the doctor's stern orders to rest, and Eleanor found herself alternately scolding him when he tried to do too much, and laughing at his frustrated attempts to argue that he was perfectly capable of walking to the window unassisted. And these small domestic battles became precious to her because they were so beautifully normal, so utterly unlike the careful formality that had characterized their marriage before, and they talked during those long, quiet days as they had never talked before, honestly and openly about everything, about their childhoods and disappointments, about their hopes for the future and fears they had carried in silence, about what kind of marriage they wanted to build now that they had admitted the truth of their hearts. And Edmund spoke haltingly at first, still unused to such vulnerability, about his loneliness as a child in Hartley Hall's vast cold rooms, about watching his mother fade into melancholy and his father retreat into coldness, about his determination never to inflict such pain on another person, and his terror when he realized he was falling in love with Eleanor, because love seemed to him synonymous with inevitable heartbreak. And Eleanor listened and shared her own fears, her resignation to a loveless marriage, and her surprise when that resignation transformed into something that felt dangerously like hope. And Edmund would pull her close with his good arm and whisper apologies against her hair for all the months of distance, and Eleanor would kiss his forehead and tell him that those months had brought them here, to this honesty, and perhaps they had needed that time to understand what they were building. And slowly, Edmund's strength returned, and the day came when the doctor pronounced him well enough to travel, and the journey back to Hartley Hall felt entirely different from any journey they had taken before, because Edmund kept Eleanor close beside him in the carriage, his arm around her shoulders, and they talked and laughed and occasionally fell into comfortable silence. And when Hartley Hall came into view, Edmund said quietly, "It looks different now, doesn't it? Not so cold." And Eleanor understood that it was not the house that had changed but them, and when they arrived, the servants lined up in formal greeting, but their eyes widened in shock, because the Viscount was handing his wife down from the carriage himself and keeping her hand clasped in his, and at dinner that first night back, Edmund scandalized Mrs. Daventry by insisting Eleanor sit beside him rather than at the opposite end of the long table. And afterward, he led Eleanor to his study and showed her the estate books and asked her opinion on matters he had once kept entirely to himself. And when they retired for the evening, Edmund hesitated at the corridor where their separate chambers diverged, and Eleanor saw the question in his eyes and felt her heart race as she said softly, "I don't want separate rooms anymore, Edmund. I want to be your wife in every way." And the joy that flooded his face was answer enough. And that night Eleanor finally understood what marriage could be when built on honesty and love, rather than duty and distance. And in the weeks that followed, the entire household noticed the transformation. The Viscount, who smiled freely now, who sought his wife's company constantly, who looked at Lady Hartley as if she were the sun around which his world turned, and Eleanor bloomed under such attention, her own happiness radiating outward until even stern Mrs. Daventry was heard humming while she worked, and Hartley Hall itself seemed to warm and brighten as if the very stones responded to the love now dwelling within its walls. Summer arrived at Hartley Hall with an abundance that seemed to mirror the transformation within its walls, and the rose garden that Eleanor had once proposed restoring now bloomed in glorious profusion, each flower a testament to patience and careful tending. And Eleanor would walk among the roses in the early morning with her hand resting on Edmund's arm, and he would look at her with such open adoration that the gardeners would smile to themselves and speak in the village of how the Viscount had changed, how love had softened him into someone warmer and more generous than anyone had thought possible. And indeed Edmund's opened heart extended far beyond his wife, reaching out to touch every aspect of the estate, and he implemented Eleanor's suggestions for tenant welfare with enthusiasm, establishing a small school where the children could learn to read and write, improving cottages that had fallen into disrepair, listening to concerns that he once would have dismissed as beneath his notice, and the people who lived and worked on Hartley lands began to look at their lord with affection rather than mere respect, and they understood that Lady Hartley had wrought this change, that her gentle influence had reached the Viscount's heart and transformed it utterly. And Eleanor herself seemed to glow with happiness. Her earlier loneliness and resignation burned away by the warmth of Edmund's love, and she spent her mornings in the gardens and her afternoons visiting tenant families, bringing baskets of food and staying to hold babies and admire children's drawings, and the women would watch her go and say to each other that she was a true lady, kind and genuine. And wasn't it wonderful that she and the Viscount had found such happiness together? And in the evenings Edmund would often find Eleanor in the music room that had been locked since his mother's death, the room he had finally opened for her because he could deny her nothing, and Eleanor had taken up playing the pianoforte, her fingers moving across the keys with growing confidence, and Edmund would stand in the doorway listening with visible love softening his features, and sometimes he would cross the room and sit beside her on the bench, and she would teach him simple melodies and laugh when his large hands fumbled over the keys, and he would catch her hands in his and kiss her fingers and tell her she was the music that had brought life back into this house. And one warm afternoon in late July, as they sat together in the rose garden, Eleanor took Edmund's hand and placed it gently on her abdomen and said softly, "Edmund, there is something I need to tell you, something wonderful." And she watched his face transform as understanding dawned, watched joy and awe and tender fear flicker across his features, and he whispered, "Eleanor, are you certain?" And when she nodded, he pulled her close and buried his face in her hair, and she felt him trembling, and he said brokenly, "I never thought I would have this, never thought I deserved it. A wife I love beyond measure and now a child." And Eleanor held him and whispered that he deserved every happiness, that they would build a family filled with love and laughter, nothing like the cold childhood he had endured, and Edmund pulled back to cup her face in his hands and kissed her with such tenderness that Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. And he said, "You have given me everything, Eleanor. You have transformed my entire world, and I swear to you I will spend every day of my life proving myself worthy of this gift." And Eleanor smiled through her tears and told him he already had, and they sat together in the garden they had restored together, surrounded by roses and summer warmth, and made plans for the nursery, and spoke of names, and laughed about their hopes for their child, and the joy that radiated from them was so pure and uncontained that even Mrs. Daventry, watching from a window, felt her stern features soften into a smile, and all of Hartley Hall seemed to celebrate with them, the very stones warm and welcoming, the gardens abundant, everything alive and thriving, as if the house itself had awakened from a long, cold sleep into vibrant summer. 5 years had passed since that summer when Eleanor first told Edmund they would have a child, and now on a golden afternoon in late September, they stood together at the window of the music room, watching their children play in the rose garden below. Catherine, who was 4 and had her mother's gentle nature and love of flowers, and Thomas, barely 2, who followed his sister everywhere on unsteady legs, with Edmund's serious blue eyes and Eleanor's quick smile, and the sight of them chasing each other around the blooming roses, while their nursemaid watched indulgently filled. Eleanor, with a happiness so profound it sometimes frightened her with its intensity, as if such joy could not possibly last, and Edmund, sensing her thoughts as he so often did now, pulled her closer and kissed her temple, and said softly, "It's real, Eleanor, all of it, and it's ours." And she leaned into him and marveled once again at the miracle of their transformation, how a marriage that began in cold formality and duty had become this warm abundance of love and laughter, and Edmund still bore the scar on his shoulder from the bullet he had taken for her, a silvered mark that Eleanor sometimes traced with her fingers in the quiet of their shared chamber, and he would catch her hand and kiss it, and tell her he would take 1,000 bullets if it meant keeping her safe, and she would scold him gently for such dramatic declarations, even as her heart swelled with love, and their life together had become everything. Neither of them had dared to hope for a true partnership, built on honesty and trust, a family filled with warmth and affection, an estate that thrived under their joint stewardship, and a love that deepened with each passing season. And Eleanor thought often of that frightened girl who had agreed to marry a cold stranger to save her father from ruin, how she could never have imagined that her duty would lead her to such profound happiness. And Edmund confessed that he thought often of the man he had been, so determined to protect himself from feeling anything that he had nearly missed the greatest gift of his life. And they agreed that the bandit attack, terrible as it had been in the moment, had given them an unexpected grace, because it had shattered Edmund's carefully constructed walls and forced them both to acknowledge what had been growing between them all along. And now, as they watched Catherine help Thomas pick a rose, steadying his small hand to avoid the thorns, Eleanor said quietly, "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been if you hadn't insisted I accompany you to London that spring?" And Edmund was silent for a moment before answering, "I think some part of me already knew I loved you, already knew I needed to keep you close even though I wouldn't admit it to myself, and perhaps that's why I insisted, why I couldn't bear to leave you behind." And Eleanor turned in his arms to face him, and saw in his eyes the same depth of love she had seen on the day he first confessed his feelings. And she rose on her toes to kiss him and whispered, "Then I am grateful for every moment, even the frightening ones, because they brought us here." And Edmund held her close, and watched their children playing in the garden they had restored together, and his heart was full of a peace he had never known in all his years before, and Hartley Hall around them seemed to hum with contentment, its rooms warm and filled with life, its gardens abundant, its people cared for and thriving, everything transformed by the love that had taken root within its walls and grown into something beautiful and enduring. Dear listener, perhaps you have heard in this story an echo of your own heart, your own fears and walls built to protect yourself from pain, and I would tell you gently that those walls, however necessary they may have seemed, can also keep out the very love you most need, and sometimes it takes a crisis, a moment when all pretense is stripped away, to show us what truly matters, to give us the courage to be vulnerable and honest with those we love. And Edmund and Eleanor's journey reminds us that transformation is always possible, that hearts long frozen can thaw, that marriages built on duty can become partnerships of deep affection, if we are brave enough to let down our defenses and risk being truly seen, and their happiness was not granted easily or without cost. Edmund bears the scar of his sacrifice still, and both of them carry memories of lonely months when they circled each other in careful distance. But those trials refined them, taught them the value of what they were building, and made their eventual joy all the sweeter for having been earned through patience and courage. And so if you find yourself in a place of loneliness or resignation, if you have built walls around your heart or settled for less than you deserve, Take comfort in knowing that stories like theirs are possible, that love can breach even the strongest defenses, that vulnerability is not weakness, but rather the greatest strength, and that sometimes the most unexpected arrangements lead to the most extraordinary happiness, if we are willing to be patient, to be honest, and to take the risk of opening our hearts even when we are afraid. May you find the courage to let down your own walls, may you discover love in unexpected places, and may you rest tonight in the peace of knowing that transformation is always possible for those brave enough to seek it. If this story has touched your heart, dear listener, I invite you to subscribe to Dreamy Tales, where we explore the transformative power of love in all its forms, and may your dreams be filled with roses and summer light and the warmth of a hand held in yours.